So today I want to talk about, for some reason I felt the need to talk about Advance Wars. That was an old Game Boy Advance game. It's a really fun strategy game, so it'd be fun to talk about it, and I think it might deserve a little bit more attention, especially since the series seemed to be a little bit forgotten these days. It's actually based on older titles, the so-called Wars series on the old Japanese Famicom and the Super Famicom, and even Japanese Game Boy. These games were in Japan only, so they're not as well known here overseas. But with the Game Boy Advance, it was decided to give Advance Wars an advance overseas release. So for this purpose, it was also changed a little bit to appeal to the other Western audience, especially. The mechanics were simplified a little bit. They even added an in-depth tutorial, so it's easier for new players to play the game without having to read the manual and more complicated stuff that the Japanese gamers are used to. And so this way the game is a little bit easier to pick up and play and have fun with it. And the result is great. It's a really cool, fun game. It gives you a choice, actually, of playing the campaign now. The older Famicom Wars actually had no campaign and no story. They did have different factions and commanders, like the Advance Wars has, but it was just random maps. You couldn't really have any campaign or story, so this is a novelty here. But of course, on the Game Boy Advance, you also have other modes, like you can play solo maps where you can choose your commanders or have like challenges against set commanders. So there's quite a lot to do, and there's also a store where you can buy other maps, so there's quite a lot of replay value here. Now the gameplay itself is pretty straightforward, it's pretty simple. It's turn-based, so you and the enemy have a bunch of tanks, soldiers, planes, and artillery unit on the map, and you will move them individually. So each turn, one player will get to move their tanks and planes, and other turn, the AI or other players, if you're playing multiplayer, will get to do it in that form. The goal is pretty simple. You have to either capture the enemy HQ or destroy all of the enemy's units. Every unit has its unique place in the game, so there's a lot of units with their different roles. For example, you have infantry. Their main purpose is to take over cities, and they're also cheap, so they're cost effective. Then you have the recon unit, for example, that one can scout and can take out the infantry. And then we have the tank. It's a main battle unit, and it will decimate the recon unit. But we also have, like, for example, an artillery unit, which can counter the tanks and destroy them from afar. But the artillery unit is weak from being attacked up close, so if it gets caught by a tank unit up close, it's going to get destroyed. And then, of course, there's also airplanes and ships and submarines, so there's quite a lot of units, and it can get quite complicated, especially when all of these units are involved. The damage also depends on other factors, so it also depends on who attacks first. The attacker will always get a bonus damage, and the attacked will only get a counter attack, which is significantly weaker. And there's also the terrain factor, so if you're, for example, standing in a city or in a mountain, you will get a defense bonus, so you will be stronger that way, while on a plane, you will be a lot weaker. However, the plane is also easier to traverse, so being on a plane is advantageous because you can travel faster that way. It might sound complicated, but all the damage is calculated automatically before you even attack, and it gives you a little information so you can see whether an attack makes sense. So it's pretty simple that way. Units can either be pre-deployed on the map or they can be bought in factories. So when we have the money involved, the cost effectiveness factor must also be considered when making up a strategy. So the gameplay this way is, in a way, pretty simple, yet it's also complex at the same time. It's pretty cool, however the only downside of this gameplay is that the game can drag, especially on larger maps, because every unit needs to be moved individually, and especially if we have more factions in the same battle, it can drag for quite a lot of time. The animation can be turned off, so it gets a little bit faster this way, but still, they can drag quite a lot. Probably the best appeal about the game is the design and the look of the game itself. Although the theme of war is as serious as it can possibly get, the presentation is extremely light-hearted. All troops and commanders are represented in very cute anime-like style. Commanders are diverse in both age and gender. We have everything from battle-hardened veterans to schoolgirls commanding entire armies. It's pretty fun, so every commander is pretty unique in look, and in abilities. So, for example, a commander like Sammy, she has a bonus on infantry, so if your playstyle is more based on infantry, you're going to want to play with her. Or you can choose Max if you're more for direct attacks, for example, with tanks, but he's weaker with artillery units, for example. So every player can have a favorite commander depending on his or her playstyle. There's a lot of little things that make the game quite fun. For example, when the units engage in battle, the commander's reaction will be displayed on the screen in the top of the fighting area. And it's pretty funny because it's extremely emotional, over the top, so they can either laugh and enjoy, or they can cry in pain seeing their units get destroyed. It's quite ridiculous. Especially the design was even more ridiculous than Japanese version. So Olaf, who was like a Russian-style commander, was literally dressed as a Santa Claus in that version, and we had a captain guy, Drake, who is literally dressed like a pirate, and Sonya literally has a pink schoolgirl uniform with glasses, and Grit had a nice cowboy hat, and Kanbei was literally wearing samurai armor, and of course the skirts were also shorter in Japanese versions, so... Of course, especially taking the Japanese representation in mind, the game is obviously not meant to be taken seriously at all, but one thing that I sort of maybe realized, especially with the design being so ridiculous, is how funny it is if you maybe take the game seriously, think about it seriously. To be honest, like, I assume that most of the people listening to the review know about Advance Wars, so this could be a separate video, but, you know, it's pretty funny if you think about it, like, the world that the game takes place in is literally called the Wars world. So it's literally a world of endless wars, and all of the life here revolves around war. Conflicts are ordinary, part of ordinary life in this place, and different nations are used to having skirmishes all the time without it being a big deal. There's no serious negotiations before they fight. They just fight completely on impulse without thinking about it very much. And everywhere you go, there's infrastructure capable of moving heavy military equipment around. There's military factories, air bases, and seaports pretty much everywhere in this world, which are capable of deploying units immediately. The nation that the game focuses on is Orange Star. At the beginning of the game, they're at war with Blue Moon, and the reason for that is never mentioned, it's never brought up. It's just a normal part of life that these two nations are at war. Nothing special. Our protagonists, Andy, Sammy, and Max, during the story of the campaign, they get in a bunch of skirmishes with other nations, and there's never any formal declarations of war, there's no serious discussion. It's pretty obvious that there's a lot of confusion, and they don't really think much before going to war. And especially the battles with Yellow Comet are the most absurd, because Kanbei, the leader of the Yellow Comet faction, he's obsessed with destroying the enemy and he doesn't even bother talking to them. Now his daughter Sonya tries telling him to stop multiple times, but he doesn't listen, only after a bunch of battles. And of course it turns out that it's all just a misunderstanding, but he does show remorse, I suppose, but never during the game is any loss of life being acknowledged, the destruction of war. And if I spoil the story a little bit, it turns out, of course, that in the end, all the conflicts were being manipulated by a third party. So, Stroom, the main evil bad guy, he's commanding the Black Hole forces, and he was manipulating them all the time into fighting, all this time. And, of course, at the end of the game, they all unite, and they fight the real enemy. But again, the loss of life is never really acknowledged. Obviously, it's not meant to be taken too seriously, but, you know, especially taking this carefree, cartoonish take on modern war, and especially this take on modern war makes the game kinda unique, and it makes it stand out from everything else that's out there. The game is made by the same studio as Fire Emblem, so the similarities in gameplay will be obvious pretty fast to somebody who played both the games. However, there's a strong difference between this and Fire Emblem. The big difference is that in Fire Emblem, you never want to lose anyone. So death in Fire Emblem is taken very seriously, and characters will get emotional, they will get angry, they will get sad. In Advance Wars, all of units are generic, they're completely expendable, completely disposable. Nobody will really be angry on you if you lose a bunch of units. It doesn't matter. So sacrificing a recon unit, for example, to stop enemy tanks from attacking expensive rocket artillery units, is in Advance Wars a completely reasonable and cost-effective strategy, while doing a pragmatic move like this in Fire Emblem would usually be unthinkable to most of the players who try to save everyone as much as possible. So the reception of the game was actually quite positive. It was succeeded by a bunch of sequels, which we can talk about later. And the cool thing is that the popularity of this game actually contributed pretty greatly to the decision to release Fire Emblem games in the West. So that's pretty cool. So it's a cool game. If you want to play as a schoolgirl commanding an entire army of tanks against a guy dressed in a Japanese World War II uniform with a katana sword, go ahead, this is the game for you.